Welcome to Are You Done Yet? The podcast brought to you by Innovative E, the 2023 and 2024 Microsoft Partner of the Year winner and a 7-time Microsoft Award winner in the last 6 years. Hosted by Mike Taylor, CEO of Innovative E, and Bryan Quick, Senior Director of Business Development, this podcast is your go-to resource for transforming your organization's project and work management strategies. And now, Mike Taylor and Bryan Quick.
Hello, folks. Welcome to Are You Done Yet? A podcast where we address your project management modernization. And today, in episode 2 of our modernization series, we're going to talk about the history and evolution of project management. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Bryan. Speaking of project management, you got some kind of project going on there. I see, looks like you're in a motorhome.
Yeah, we are on a cross-country road trip with the family, but I couldn't miss an episode of Are You Done Yet?
Awesome. Yeah, it's quite a project to put all that together and all the planning and everything, right?
I'd like to say it's well planned, Mike, but get 4 kids and 2 dogs and an RV, and all plans go out the window, so to speak.
Yeah, it's the art of planning that really makes it happen, not the actual plan, right? I think that was how we said that.
Right, and then there's always the risk management that's involved with the RV road trips, but we don't need to get into details. Today we're supposed to talk about the history and evolution of project management, sort of a chronological list of things of the way we see it and the way we've seen it evolve, because we kind of been around the block for a while. I got a few gray hairs here from my project management days.
Me too, quite a few.
So a little historic perspective. Let's start with the evolution of project management and its, constant adoption and change to what's going on the ground and how that's evolved. Some of the early tools we've seen as far as Gantt charting and CPM. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, obviously, before the age of computers and digital project management, digital work management in general, you had, the Gantt charts were a way to start to logically lay out. And it was actually created by, I believe his name was Henry Gantt. He was a general, I believe in World War I, to really lay out, sequencing of activities and things like that. So, ironically, talk about the history of it, though. As you know, I did some of my early career out at NASA Kennedy Space Center. And they had rooms. They were no longer using these, but they had these things called mag boards. And these mag boards were floor to ceiling. They looked like whiteboards, but they were magnetic. And they had these little chip kind of looking things that were actually tasks. And what you would do, and they had vertical lines on these, and those could be dates. And you would actually go and you would take, and some of these were pre-printed with different operations or different activities, and they would lay them out sequentially on there. And they had some of them that you could actually just write on, and you could write activities in. So it was actually a very manual way to go out and build the charts. We weren't using them, but they were still there. We were actually using software. I'm not that old, but but it was interesting to see that that's the way they would do it. And they had apparently they didn't have them in the rooms anymore when I was there, but they had cameras they would set up. They had professional photographers, and they would take pictures of them, and then they would run these Gantt charts off, to show all the sequencing and the dependencies and everything, and those would be distributed among the teams, and that's how they would, that was their work breakdown structure that they were working to.
Yeah, I did something similar when I worked at Cars.com. We would have the big board, and we would all get together in a room when we were starting a project, and we would have the sticky notes. And I would give sticky notes to everybody in the room, and then they would kind of list the tasks that they felt they had to do in order to accomplish the project in their role, and then we would post them on the board in the order in which they needed to occur.
Right.
And of course, that's not really representing a Gantt chart yet. It's really just kind of putting the order of the tasks in there. And then the next part of that was, how long would that take you to do, and what are the prerequisites, dependencies, and things like that. But at least you were kind of brainstorming on the order of operations, if you will. So there's different ways to accomplish that I've seen over time, but the Gantt chart's tried and true, and now there are alternative methodologies, as you know, and as we're going to talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, but leading off of the Gantt charts, then what came about was the whole concept of critical path methodology, right? So you would lay out your multiple paths that can go, some mini paths or parallel in a project or a program, right? And then you have your dependencies. The most famous of dependencies is, of course, your finish to start dependency, but you can have a start to start or a finish to finish. And there's all kinds of different types of dependencies you can have. But, the critical path methodology would actually go and look at what's the piece, the path of task that represents the longest path in there, and any delay in any of the task would actually move the end milestone or move the end of the project. So that would be a way that, and then obviously when computers came around, you could enter all the information. You could put in everything to define your task and your dependencies, and then it would go reason through it, and it would do forward and backward passes to figure out your critical path and identify those items that are on the critical path. So the CPM methodology in the early days of software was really a big part of what the waterfall kind of approach was really being used for. And of course, some of those early products were things like Microsoft Project, which was introduced in, I think, 1984. I think Microsoft bought the product, but it was a DOS base. It wasn't even a graphical interface kind of thing. It had, basically it drew out on the screen that your Gantt charts and your work breakdown structures and things like that. But that was the earliest of the digital. There may have been some others before that, but that's the earliest one that I was familiar with.
Yeah, I remember reading The Goal by Eli Goldratt early in my project management career, explaining the process of critical chain and the theory involved. And it was a great book. It reads sort of like a novel, but it teaches a lot of really good understanding when you're done with it of how this all works. I think there's a visualization in there where, everybody in the project team is sort of like walking together and they're kind of chained together, and the project isn't over until the last person crosses the line.
Right. Yeah. He took the Eli Gold. I can't say his name. Eli Goldratt. Yeah. He took the basic CPM methodology and he did a lot of analysis on it. And I think what he was doing is really trying to figure out where there's potential inefficiencies in it. So it was kind of an evolution of the basic CPM methodology, and allowed people to start thinking about where you could optimize things within that chain, as he would call it, the critical chain. So it wasn't just critical path. And so that was one of the evolutionary approaches towards really looking at a methodology for project management. And there's, of course, been a lot more that have come along, starting with, and we talk about the waterfall because it looks like a waterfall with your finish to start. Of course, critical chain. Then agile methodologies really started to rise in, about 20 or 25 years ago, really focused around the way you could do work management without necessarily worrying about all the dependencies and the time-phase task management. So it was more, you did a lot of that in your career at Cars and some of the other places, right? And Scrum and Agile type stuff, right?
Yeah, I led some agile transformations in different departments, and I was a certified Scrum Master there, and I really bought into the concepts and the methodology behind it. As far as software development was concerned, it was really helpful for us. But even then, I was doing kind of both. I was doing waterfall when it was appropriate and agile when it was appropriate. And so I think there's a time and a place for sort of all that. I remember one of the projects I had there. We really had to figure out what the critical path was, and so what I would do is get together with my team, and we would. This was when we were all co-located, so
all really the same office.
So we would get together and around the project status meeting, and I had a football that I brought to the team meeting, and I would basically throw it to the person that had the next task in the critical path. So they had sort of a physical attachment to the fact that they had the ball, and if they were on the critical path, which meant, of course, that if that task goes longer than scheduled, then the project will be late, and unless we're able to make it up in some other area. And there's many tasks on a project schedule that are not on the critical path, and it's also important to know whether or not, even if you're not on the critical path, kind of how your task relates to the critical path, because you may get on the critical path at some point. The critical path evolves, and so you may get the ball at some point. So I always took time to explain that to my project team and what it meant.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple really interesting things there. You talked about you continued even when you went hard over into the Scrum and Agile methodologies, became certified and everything else. You bought into it, but you also found yourself doing some of the traditional project
Mhm.
management things like critical path analysis. And I found the same thing. Many years ago, I was charged with running a lot of software development teams, and we were in the early days of really adopting a lot of the agile methodology. So the teams would go do their, they would lay out their epics and their sprints, and we would manage to that. But we still many times had these software development efforts were part of a larger project. So you had different infrastructure pieces, IT infrastructure and things that were going on. And then you had a software development piece, and then you had the next piece. So what we ended up doing is using a blend. And I think that was the early days of, I think people are calling it like Wagile now or something, right?
Yeah.
So it's waterfall and agile. And maybe that's been around for a while, but I found that we were doing that quite a bit. I would use things like Microsoft Project to manage the tasks, the dependencies of the major things that were going on. And then I could take basically just kind of, I mock it up sort of and say that this task now represents all this other stuff that's being managed in a different methodology and a different thing, because you don't have, if you're using Jira or Azure DevOps or some of these other tools that are built around agile development, they don't have time-based task management necessarily. So I would just put a bar in there that would say this task now is representative of this other work, and then I would update it accordingly if it was going to change. And that way I could still manage my critical path and my timeline and understand where things were going while I was still doing this other work in a different methodology. Of course, part of that was manual. I had to kind of go back and forth on that. Also found though that there's kind of a iterative agile or iterative waterfall approach that happens a lot too, right? You've got these tasks that aren't really being managed in agile. They're more like regular waterfall tasks, but they become iterative. You do them and then you go back and you do it again. You do it again maybe until you get it right. Like testing is one of those things that may be in that camp if you're managing it that way. And you find that you can blend those together, albeit even if it's manually, to achieve the outcomes that you need to do to still manage your resources and your timelines and all that kind of stuff.
And for those of you listening, you can tell that neither Mike nor I are religious about this topic. We don't prescribe to the religion of agile project management or waterfall project management. We sort of prescribe to the whatever is appropriate camp. So
Yep.
So and then tried and true. You have a lot of folks even still using, as you know, Microsoft Project, which was really the first large project management tool, like for the masses on the market. I mean, there were others out there, of course.
Right.
That one was the most prolific. I think at one time there were 40 or 50 million users across the world of Project.
And the interesting thing about that, you mentioned that, is the evolution of that particular tool followed the evolution of computing in general, right? Because it started, like we talked about, as a desktop tool for an individual project manager running on DOS, and then they moved it into a Windows environment, but it was still very much individualized. And then I think it was around 2003, wasn't it, that they came out with the first version of what ultimately became known as Project Server. I think it was called Team Manager or something like that.
Right.
And so what that did, though, is that was that was following kind of the client server architecture and approach of computing now. So it allowed these individual desktop managers to then publish their projects to a central server, and then it would aggregate the information. So it started getting a lot more interesting, right? Because you could do things like aggregate your resources and do things across projects that you couldn't do when you were just working at the desktop, right?
Yeah, it was called Project Central, I think.
Project Central, that's right.
Yeah,
I
remember that.
Yeah.
Methodologies that we've kind of touched on that, but let's kind of move fast forward till when we started this podcast, which was 2019, 2020, and when really the advent of Microsoft Teams and other Teams like tools came into being, and then that was largely during the era of forced separation and work from home, which I mean, we were doing work from home back before then when I was leading teams, and I was always an advocate of it. But even for the folks that were kind of shying away from it. This was basically the reality. It became the reality, and project teams were no longer co-located. And I think that's generally accepted as the norm now. I know a lot of folks are going back, into the office more and more, and that's great. But I think it's the norm that people are not going to be co-located necessarily. And
Right.
those of us that were managing global projects before, of course, we have our group in Sri Lanka. We've never really been co-located for a lot of
Right.
our initiatives. So that necessitated a new approach to communication, collaboration, et cetera. So how did project management evolve or change during that period?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. So I'll answer by going back just one step to things like the original project server, Teams server. What'd you call it? Team
Project Central. That's
Project
okay.
Central. Thank you. I can't get that.
I'm sort of an encyclopedia of useless knowledge.
That's very useful information. Our Microsoft friends will be happy that you remembered the right term for the
There
right
was
product.
a book that went on the shelf that showed how to administer it, and
Yeah,
somebody still has it probably in their shelf when they're listening to this podcast.
probably. So the one of the really interesting components of that technology when you pulled it into a client server capability is they used SharePoint or SharePoint services at the time to do the collaboration component. So that was a little bit game changing for me doing project management, because up to that point, whenever we built a project team, I had to go to IT and get them to provision, a file share or something so we could put everything and start collaborating in the same space. But with the SharePoint capabilities, it just built that collaboration, and the project manager could do that right out of the box. You didn't have to go involve IT or anyone else, which I thought was awesome because I was managing a lot of projects at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I remember that too. It was. I remember wanting to connect these things together. There were different reasons why you wanted to connect them together, instead of having all your MPP files on a file share somewhere, which was. And then you could actually use one as. Remember this? You could use one as the master,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then the
That
other
was a little
ones
dicey though.
could be sub projects, and they could have
Yep.
interdependencies between them and stuff like that.
Yep.
But it was very fragile.
It was
Right?
very
Because
fragile.
it's all on the file server, and then,
Yeah.
but what Project Server brought to the table is it was a database, right?
hmm
And then
Yep.
when they started adding the collaborative aspects of SharePoint to it, that's when things really took hold.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say that to say, because you asked me about like Teams and stuff like that. So I think Teams took that to the next level, right?
It did.
Because you were really doing the collaboration component as part of the core platform now, because
Right.
O365, the Office suite and everything, Teams now comes with it. And Teams is actually its own collaboration and work management system in of itself,
Right.
and it's built on the Power Platform. So it actually has underpinnings of SharePoint and file management, but you can do all the artifact management. You can create your teams like I did with Project Server early. And as a project manager, you can add people and permissions, get them security trimmed the way you want them. And you can do everything right from that experience. And even if you're not managing projects, you're probably spending nowadays, you mentioned, a lot of people are doing remote work. Everybody's working virtually, even if they are working with teams that aren't co-located, even if they're working in an office. Like you said, the big globalization has only continued and accelerated over the last 20 years. We have offices in Sri Lanka. Even 15 years ago, I was working with folks in Sri Lanka and India and South America and places like that. So, and our customers are that way too. We have a lot of global enterprises that are virtually on all the major continents, right? So they're working with folks all over the place. So working in an environment with a virtual collaboration and work system like Teams at the core of all the work you're doing, it makes sense to then start to do the project management work there as well. So I think that's been kind of a real game changer. Because not only is it a good, easy way to do the collaboration, but it also has all the extensibility underneath it. So I think that's been a huge kind of mind shift that we start with collaboration, and you say that all the time, right? Put collaboration first, and then start to work on the individual execution tools for your project and work management.
Yeah, I've always felt that the collaborative aspects of project management should be more weighted than the tool that you're using. I understand that tools can bring a lot of data forward, and they can help you realize situations before they happen, and helps you plan it out. Don't get me wrong, but Projects are about getting things done. It's about working together as a team, collaborating, and getting things done at the end of the day.
Yep.
Even if we had no plan or no tools, probably wouldn't be done as efficiently and effectively, but we could all get it done still. We could all team together and do it.
Right.
And that's the way I've always led teams, and that's the way that I think we should put collaboration first always.
Right.
And
So interesting.
An opportunity, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
That teams gives us that opportunity, as you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So now fast forward a little further, and we found this proliferation over the last 10 plus years of all these cloud-based, born in the cloud type solutions, as well as things on the Microsoft platform.
Yeah.
So you've got Monday, Asana, Wrike, Smartsheet, Project Planner, ClickUp, you can go on and on, all these different tools. Each one has its own collaboration type capability in it. But most enterprises are using multiple versions of this. Some of them sprung up through shadow IT. Sometimes there's business justification to go build a tool here, and so there you almost always see some flavor of agile in a large organization for using Jira or Azure DevOps for the software development, like we talked about earlier. And then you almost always see some form of project management tool that has the traditional waterfall dependency management things like Project Online. Project for the web, now New Planner, and then all the third-party ones we just talked about. But they all have their own way of managing the collaboration features. So now what we're starting to think and see and do for our customers is, when you talk about modernizing, is we talk about really using the collaboration platform, Teams itself, to start with doing all your project management, right? Make that the central, like you're talking about.
Yeah. They're so prolific, and I understand the attraction of web-based project management, task management tools. They're easy to get. They're easy to stand up because they're not integrated with your technology environment really in any way. I mean, maybe single sign-on or something like that.
Right.
Understand the attraction of that, but I think what we're realizing now is that you're going to use Teams anyway, or at least 9 out of 10 of you are going to use Teams anyway. So, and that's separating your project collaboration from your general organizational collaboration. Is that really what you want?
Right, absolutely. And the proliferation, again, going back to the pandemic, the proliferation of the Slack, Teams, Zoom, all those it's just exploded. And in the Microsoft space, it's obviously Teams, and I think there's over 320 million Teams users now. And what's interesting about that is, a lot of analysts will tell you that about 80% of people, the information workers that are out there that are using Teams, are doing some form of project type work. It's project, it's in nature. It's got a beginning and end and some scope that they're trying to achieve. So that's about 270 million people that are doing some form of project or work management using the Teams platform. So that's why we really have really focused in on using that as the central piece of modernization for project and work management for our customers, and to a great deal of success.
Right. On this road trip I'm on with the family here, Mike, we visited Gettysburg, and and we were going through the battlefield and Civil War history, and I recall that one of the reasons that the South ended up losing the war was logistics, right? They had different railroad gauges in the South, I think 4 or 7 different gauges of railroad, and they couldn't get goods from one place to another. And can you draw an analogy to like using different systems for different departments and different project management systems for collaboration, because your data is then segmented?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I don't think I mentioned this, but recent surveys have shown that the average organization uses 5.7 project or work management tools to manage their initiatives across their enterprise. So if, Bryan, you're tasked with doing something with IT and you're using Project Online, say, and then you're also going over and working with the marketing department and they're using Asana, and then if you're going to work with somebody else, you've got all these different ways that your data is in each of those siloed areas. Your collaboration is being centralized around there. And so you're having to learn a different app. So, and everybody has to learn it, not just the project manager. That's the important thing, right? All of the users have to learn how to use that app. And so it can become very inefficient. There's cost overlap. There's, ways that you're really not, probably the most important piece that we see is it's really the data disparity, the siloed data, because even using only 1 or 2 tools, project managers tend to spend a lot of time chasing data, trying to find
Right.
the right information. Some of it's in the tool. Oftentimes you have to marry it up with other things that may or may not be available digitally, information around financial stuff or other things you have to go pull from other systems or get reports and enter in and build your PowerPoints or whatever for your governance meetings or your project status meetings and all this kind of stuff. So
Right.
it becomes very difficult when you continue to silo things from people apps and data perspective.
Yeah, sure does. I mean, for a myriad of reasons. And I think that, more often than not, I think what's going on out there is like one marketing department has this and the HR department has that. And they're trying to collaborate on projects like together, and they end up using teams to do that. And then the data's in the respective tools and they can't report on it centrally or tie it together.
Yeah.
And of course, we have ways of solving those problems. We're not going to get into that today, but if you're interested, take a look at the show notes, and there's some resources out there that will get you started thinking about things a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and we talk about, one of the things that's always important in project management is the data visualization. So the tools that have been available, you've got Power BI and the Microsoft platform, Tableau and others for visualization and deep insights into, all the things that people care about. And a lot of these individual tools have their own data visualization capabilities and stuff. But the problem you run into is if you're doing these things in different places, you can't get an aggregate view of it. So what, you're hearing more and more about people wanting to do strategic project portfolio management. You're wanting people to do alignment. Part of that is alignment to your overall business goals, your KPIs, your OKRs, things like that. Just if you ask most organizations, can you tell me what all your information workers, what all projects they're working on? Because they have the average of 5.7 tools, right? The answer is almost always going to be no. I mean, no. I can't tell you a customer we started with, and they said, yeah, we know where all our work is going on. We can have one report that shows all the work that's going on, and maybe even all the people that are working on it. And that just does not happen because all the data is all over the place. So if you can start to bring this stuff together, then you make these visualization tools, which are used for your decision support, much more effective. But you can't, and I would go right into the next step on that, which is, the obvious thing when you start talking about data, everybody wants to talk about nowadays is AI, right?
Right. You wrote the book.
I wrote a book. I wrote a book about project management and AI. Yes, revolutionizing project management with AI.
Check the show notes for that too. It's a great read, and there's actually an audiobook as well. What we're talking about there is leveraging your entity, your corporate platform for AI and consolidating your data on that platform in order to even have a chance to start using AI effectively. We're not talking about the AI widgets that the respective work management tools have. We're talking about enterprise level AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it was interesting, and this has been in a couple of our discussions, podcasts, and things, but a little over a year ago, March of 2023, we did our first podcast talking about, it wasn't a podcast, it was a webinar, it was live. We had people online. We were talking about the benefits of AI and the things you can do with it, but we were laying the foundation by talking about how you build the data and the disconnect between people and the systems that govern the work. And because, when you're managing a project, your team members are out there coding or doing whatever they're doing. That's not the work itself that is the work, but it's not what's managing it in the system like Project or Jira or whatever. So there's a disconnect. So we were talking about that. And then some of the people were getting upset going, when you stop talking about data and start talking about some AI, and we're like, well, hold on, hold on. And now you see a lot of people talking about
that.
Even
there was
see
like
ads
the thread of the chat. And people,
it's like,
hey,
I want to see some AI.
AI in the AI webcast.
Yeah, which we did, and we showed some stuff, and I think they were happy with that. But the important part to talk about here, though, is there's a lot of interesting things you can do with AI, and people that think about doing predictive analytics and being able to do risk analysis and benefits and all this, maybe even suggesting types of projects to go do or improvements in the projects and actually having AI help with all that. That's all good aspirational goals, and we will get there. But first, you got to get really good at getting the data in. And we, as humans, are traditionally not very good, which is why a lot of these project management tools haven't succeeded to the degree they could. We quote it all the time. There's the standard line of the success rate of projects, even today, is about 35% by measured of, across the globe by all the industry experts. 65% don't fail to achieve all of the things that people want to get out of it. That whatever those metrics are. So a lot of that has to do with this disparate data situation, and to really get a good foundation to build on AI, you need to start with the pieces that can get better data in there. So use AI to create better data, and then use that data to inform the people. And then as the decisions are being made, you can continue to build the AI out better, and the AI can then start to do more of the robust things. Some people are calling this type of thing a symbiotic AI relationship, or a co-work relationship between humans and AI. And I think that's really where it's going in the field of project management.
Wow. That can be really powerful stuff. But as you said, for lack of a better word, the table stakes involved are getting your data centralized.
And even by getting the data centralized, some of the early steps that you can do in there, things like, and you see it with like Microsoft's Copilot, and we've built a thing that it extends that kind of capability, just to be able to do something as simple as produce more accurate meeting notes, more accurate assignment of actions and risk and things like that, directly from the AI can read it, present it. Right. We can take a card, and the project manager can then assign it or augment the risk and probability and those kind of things. And then it gets assigned to the proper place in each and every project that you're doing this on. It's going into the right risk registry or actions log or whatever. That alone starts to save humans a lot of time, and it gets better data in there. In a related note, I read on Microsoft's AI. They have a whole thing about AI in the workplace these days. They commissioned a study, and they're finding that the top 5% of Teams users who are using the Copilots to do automatic meeting note generation are saving up to 8 hours per week. So apply that to project management, right? If you save your project manager, 1 day out of 5.
Wow.
What else can they be doing that's making those projects so much more effective?
Right, and we talked about that in a recent podcast as well, and in our webinars. It's the people aspect, the project management, the leadership, negotiation, risk, issue management that they could be doing instead of putting their manual PowerPoint presentation together. And that's the meaningful work of project management that we all signed up for and that we're all aspiring to be able to get involved in. That's what wakes us up in the morning.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot more project managers in the future, and a lot more project work to do, and information managers in the age of AI. It's just that the nature of the work is going to shift. Like you said, it's going to be much more leadership focused. It's going to be much more human centric, while the machines and AI are doing a lot more of that data munging and aggregation and that kind of stuff. So if you're a project manager who your sweet spot is, locking yourself in a room, turning the lights off, and working on Excel all day long to aggregate data, those days are limited. They may be around for a little while longer, but AI is going to take over this automation. I think Gartner came out with a study that said, I think it was last year, they said by 2030, 80% of those kinds of project management tasks, the menial tasks, data aggregation, all that will be eliminated, or will be not eliminated, but will be taken over and run automatically by AI.
Right. And I know you're working a lot with the folks over on the DigiOps side on some tools that are going to take meeting minutes and actually create actions, risks, issues, and decisions out of those minutes using AI.
Yep.
So there's a lot to look forward to there. If you want to learn more about that, show notes, www.teams4pm.com, the number 4.
Right.
All right. Mike, the obligatory, if you'd like to learn more about this topic, please visit our website, innovative-e.com, innovative-e.com,
right.
Or the DigiOps website, teams, the number 4pm.com. Like or subscribe to the podcast. We'd love to have you guys as subscribers. We'd love to get your suggestions for other topics if you'd like to put that in the notes or post a comment.
Yeah, comments would be great. We love the engagement.
Yeah, this is fun. We enjoy doing this, just kind of chatting and sharing our perspective on things. It's kind of a casual conversation. So if you have anything to add to it, let us know, and we'll evolve the conversation a bit. Next time on Are You Done Yet? We're going to be talking about understanding modernization. So what is project management modernization? What does that mean? We talk a lot about that, Mike, and just a preview of that, that modernizing project management. What's the 30-second version of that, Mike? What's the preview of that one?
Well, I'll give you the without being too much of a spoiler. And spoiler alert: it's not necessarily buying another endpoint project management tool.
Okay. Right.
What we really think about modernization being is taking the modern platform. The Microsoft platform is it's the number one, arguably, productivity platform on the planet. It's the number one, or one of the most, for low code, no code, and automation solutions. It's one of the top, if not the top, in terms of collaboration. And it's one of the top in terms of AI enablement. So we're really talking about starting to leverage those capabilities first before you start worrying about changing out another endpoint solution.
All right. Well, we'll leave that for the in-depth discussion next time.
Absolutely.
So it's been a great discussion. Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks to all your audience and listeners out there. And we'll see you next time on Are You Done Yet?
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Are You Done Yet? Remember to like and subscribe, and check out the show notes for links to Mike's book and our webinar. Leave us a comment or share your thoughts on today's topic. We value your insights and look forward to sparking a conversation about the future of project management. Join us next time as Mike and Bryan take a deep dive into the concept of project and work management modernization. We'll explore why it's more than just buying another tool and discuss the tangible benefits of modernizing your approach. Don't miss this insightful episode packed with practical insights and success stories.